Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're demystifying those seemingly abstract economic forces that dictate the prices of literally everything around us, from a simple gallon of milk to a brand new motorcycle. Whether you're just trying to budget for the month or you're a business owner figuring out how to price your latest product, the supply and demand concepts we're looking at today are the absolute bedrock of our global economy. So let's kick things off with a pretty simple question. What is actually happening behind the scenes when the cost of your daily essentials fluctuates? Why is a commodity super cheap one week and then suddenly wildly expensive the next? It's not just random chance, I promise you. There is a very distinct, measurable rhythm to all of this. To get to the bottom of it, we're going to quickly run through the baseline forces of pricing, navigate how elasticity works in business, and then look at government interventions like taxes and subsidies before finally bringing it all together with the wild roller coaster of agricultural markets. All right, part one, the forces of pricing and that famous invisible hand. Before we even think about market disruptions and crazy price shifts, we've got to establish our baseline, and that is the equilibrium price. This is the pure, invisible hand doing its thing. It's that sweet spot where downward-sloping consumer demand and upward-sloping producer supply perfectly cross paths. At this exact settling point, the market is just in total harmony. You have no shortages, and you have no surpluses. Everybody's happy. But, the real world rarely stays in perfect harmony. Real-world variables instantly alter that balance. Let's take the market for fresh curd as an example. If consumers suddenly get a raise at work, meaning a general increase in income, their demand physically shifts higher. People want to buy more, so the price naturally goes up. But what if the producer buys better, more efficient machinery? Suddenly, the cost of extracting that curd drops, supply shifts, and the price you pay actually falls, while the total amount available goes up. It's a constant tug-of-war. Which brings us to part two, navigating elasticity in business. Essentially, how companies use this tug-of-war to maximize their revenue. Picture this. You're running a business. Let's say you manufacture bikes. You've really got two buckets of variables to deal with. First, your controllable variables, things like your ad spend, product quality, or the final price tag you slap on the bike. But then you are totally at the mercy of uncontrollable variables. What if a recession hits and drops your customers' incomes, or a competitor suddenly slashes their prices? A smart manager has to anticipate those uncontrollables by strategically adjusting the things they actually can control. And all of this ties directly into the absolute golden rule of pricing, price elasticity. It's pretty straightforward. If your product is highly essential or maybe even a little addictive, meaning demand is inelastic, you can raise your prices and your total revenue reliably goes up because people just won't stop buying it. But if your product is highly elastic, meaning buyers have tons of cheaper alternatives they can jump to, a price hike is going to cause your sales to absolutely plummet. In that scenario, a price cut is actually what boosts your bottom line. Okay, moving on to part three, tools of government intervention. This is where the heavy hand steps in. Look, the free market is efficient, but it isn't always fair. When everyday essentials become dangerously expensive, say during a national crisis or a war, the government might step in and slap a price ceiling on things. They literally draw a hard, legal line, forcibly capping the cost below that natural equilibrium we talked about earlier, just to protect everyday buyers. It's an absolute lifeline for consumers, though to be fair, it often leads to temporary shortages since producers aren't super thrilled to supply goods at that artificially lower price. But what if the government wants to protect the sellers instead? Well, then they set up a price floor. This is a legally mandated minimum price that sits above the natural equilibrium, guaranteeing a minimum return for the producers. The catch here is just simple math. Setting the price artificially high restricts how much consumers want to buy, while producers are suddenly eager to supply way more. So you inevitably end up creating a massive surplus of goods that the market just won't naturally absorb. Let's roll into part four to see how this expands. We're talking taxes, subsidies, and shifting those market curves by design. Ever wonder why governments heavily tax things like alcohol and tobacco? It's completely strategic. They know these goods are highly price inelastic. Even if the price jumps because of a new tax, consumers will generally just keep buying them, which guarantees reliable revenue for the state. But here's the truly fascinating part. Who actually pays that tax? It's called tax incidence. If consumer demand is flexible, the producer ends up eating the cost. But if the supply is what's flexible, that tax burden gets passed right down to you, the buyer. Adding an excise duty physically alters the entire market landscape. The tax literally forces the original supply line to shift upward, meaning the market has to find a brand new, higher equilibrium. The result is pretty undeniable. The overall quantity of the good being sold shrinks, and the final price tag for the consumer jumps up. It is a design disruption meant to reform the economy and generate state funds. Now, the exact opposite of that is a subsidy. Instead of taking a cut, the government is essentially injecting cash right into the market. They provide financial grants to artificially lower the cost of production. It's an incredible tool because it encourages producers to make more of an essential good while simultaneously keeping the final price nice and low for the consumer. It's basically a win-win scenario, entirely funded by the state.
All right, part 5. Let's put all this theory to the ultimate test and look at the agricultural roller coaster. There's a reason the legendary economist Paul Samuelson dubbed farming the up and down industry. Unlike manufacturing a bicycle in a perfectly controlled factory, farming is an industry entirely at the mercy of unpredictable, uncontrollable natural fluctuations. Here's the deal with agriculture. It operates super close to what economists call perfect competition. Millions of individual farmers are basically just price takers. Not a single one of them is big enough to dictate the market price of wheat or rice. Plus, a single severe drought or a surprisingly perfect rainy season can drastically alter the entire national supply. It's an industry of wild, rapid swings that practically begs for some outside stability.
And here's where it gets crazy. Imagine a year with absolutely phenomenal weather. An incredible harvest floods the market, shifting the supply massively. You'd think a great harvest is a huge win for a farmer, right? Actually, no. Because human demand for basic food is relatively fixed. I mean, we can only eat so much. This sudden flood of supply absolutely crashes the equilibrium price. The devastating result? The farmer grew way more food, but their total revenue absolutely plummets. This is exactly why that heavy hand of the government is literally a lifesaver here. To stop farmers from going completely bankrupt during those boom years of oversupply, governments in places like India use something called a minimum support price, or MSP. Remember that price floor we discussed? This is it in action. The government guarantees a minimum price and actively buys up the leftover surplus to keep in storage as a buffer stock, effectively keeping the farmers afloat. So as we wrap up this explainer, we've really seen both sides of the coin. The invisible hand is incredibly efficient at finding a price, but it can also ruthlessly crush a producer or price out a consumer based on raw mathematical shifts. Balancing that pure, cold efficiency with the human reality of survival is the ultimate economic tightrope. So where do you think we should draw that line? Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the forces shaping our world.